I'll raise you 300 in gold dust, Bjorn. Or, Mustafa Forsell sneered, his diamond-ringed fingers digging roughly into the trembling woman's shoulder, shoving her toward the center of the smoke-filled table. I'll stake the mute. She's entirely worthless for hard labor, but she cooks a fair enough stew and doesn't complain. What do you say, mountain man? Call the bet, or walk away empty-handed. Bjorn's icy blue eyes shifted from his winning hand to the terrified, bruised woman. I call, he rumbled, tossing his heavy leather pouch onto the felt. The Golden Nugget Saloon was a festering wound in the heart of the boomtown known as Deadwood's Folly, a place where morality went to die and greed built its altars. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of cheap cigar smoke, unwashed bodies, and spilled rye whiskey. At the back table, beneath a flickering, oil-starved chandelier, a silence had fallen that was heavy enough to snap the floorboards. Mustafa Forsell, a man whose tailored silk vests could never quite hide the rot of his character, sat back with a smug, tobacco-stained grin. He was a man who owned people the way others owned cattle, viewing them strictly through the lens of utility. Beside him stood Angelo Strum, his towering, brutal enforcer, a man whose knuckles were perpetually split and scabbed from beating debtors into the mud. Across from them sat Bjorn Voynir. Bjorn was a creature of the high ridges, a mountain man whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature in the sweltering room. He wore a coat of heavy bear hide, and his beard was thick, untamed, and flecked with the grey of hard winters. He didn't come to town often, only twice a year to trade pelts and pangold for coffee, salt, and ammunition. He despised the town, despised the noise, and most of all, he despised men like Mustafa. Between them, standing in the center of the circle of men, was Brittany Seajack. She looked like a discarded rag doll. Her dress was an amalgamation of faded burlap and torn cotton, hanging loosely off a frame that was far too thin. Her head was bowed, strands of unwashed brown hair falling over her face, obscuring her features. For the 2 years she had been Mustafa's indentured servant, won in another, equally sordid card game from a desperate father who died shortly after she had not spoken a single word. The town considered her a half-wit, a broken, empty vessel, a worthless thing. Read 'em and weep, you savage, Mustafa crowed, slamming his cards down. 3 kings. The girl stays with me, and your winter gold is mine. Varjans Brozek, the town's notoriously corrupt mayor and self-appointed judge, chuckled from the sidelines. Better luck next year, Bjorn. Maybe stick to trapping beaver instead of playing with civilized men. Bjorn didn't blink. He reached out with a massive, scarred hand, and slowly, deliberately, flipped his cards over one by one. A 10 of spades, a jack of spades, a queen, a king, and an ace, a royal flush. The silence in the saloon deepened into a profound, suffocating vacuum. Lorenzo Mann, a rival prospector who had folded early, let out a low, appreciative whistle. Well, I'll be damned, Lorenzo muttered, swirling his drink. The mountain man took the house. Mustafa's face drained of color, his smugness shattering into a mask of pure, vitriolic rage. He half rose from his chair, his hand twitching toward the derringer hidden in his vest. Immediately, Angelo Strum took a threatening step forward, his hand resting on the handle of a hunting knife strapped to his thigh. Bjorn didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked up, his gaze locking with Mustafa's. It was the look of an apex predator observing a cornered rat. The gold, Bjorn said, his voice a low, geological rumble. And the woman, take the half-wit, Mustafa spat, his voice trembling with humiliated fury. He shoved Brittany so hard she stumbled and fell to her knees at Bjorn's boots. She eats more than she works anyway. You'll be bringing her back to me begging for a refund by week's end. She's broken, useless. Bjorn slowly stood up. He gathered his leather pouches, ignoring the hostile stares of Mustafa's cronies. He looked down at the trembling woman at his feet. He hadn't wanted a woman. He lived a life of brutal isolation by choice. But he had seen the bruises on her wrists, the hollow, haunted look in her eyes, and a dormant, fiercely protective instinct had flared within him. Get up, Bjorn said gently, offering a massive hand. Brittany flinched, expecting a strike. When none came, she tentatively looked up. Through the veil of her dirty hair, her eyes met his. They were a striking, piercing hazel, startlingly sharp and intensely observant. For a fraction of a second, Bjorn thought he saw something calculate and shift behind those eyes, a flash of pure, cold intelligence. But then she blinked, and the dull, empty stare returned. She ignored his hand and scrambled to her feet on her own. "Let's go," Bjorn said, turning his back on the furious Mustafa. As they walked out of the saloon, Lillian Pavone, the madam of the establishment, leaned over the upstairs balcony rail. She was a woman of sharp edges and hidden compassions, swathed in crimson velvet. "Watch your back on the trail, Bjorn," she called out, her voice cutting through the saloon's murmur. "Men like Mustafa don't lose gracefully." Bjorn didn't look back. He simply nodded, leading his new, silent shadow out into the freezing mud of the street. He had no idea that by winning this worthless woman, he had just acquired the most dangerous and valuable secret in the entire territory. The journey up to the high ridge took 2 grueling days. The wagon rumbled over treacherous, rock-strewn paths, climbing higher into the unforgiving embrace of the snow-capped peaks. The air grew thin and painfully cold. Throughout the ascent, Brittany sat rigidly in the back of the wagon, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket Bjorn had wordlessly tossed to her. She didn't complain about the cold, the bone-jarring bumps, or the meager rations of dried venison. She was simply a silent, unmoving presence. Bjorn drove the draft horses with quiet efficiency, his mind churning. What was he going to do with her? His cabin was a solitary fortress, not a home for a fragile, broken woman. He expected he would have to feed her, clothe her, and eventually, when the spring thaw came, find a safe convent or a decent family in a civilized eastern city to take her in. He expected a burden. When they finally arrived at the cabin, a sturdy, weather-beaten structure of heavy logs perched on the edge of a breathtaking gorge, Bjorn unhitched the horses. As he was leading them to the lean-to stable, he heard a rustling sound from the back of the wagon. He drew his revolver, stepping cautiously around the back. Hidden beneath a pile of empty grain sacks was a small, shivering figure. It was Winnie Torstensen, a 12-year-old orphan who worked as a stable hand in town. The girl was covered in dirt, her face bruised, her eyes wide with terror. "Winnie." Bjorn lowered his gun, his brow furrowing. "What in God's name are you doing up here?" "Please, Mr. Bjorn," Winnie stammered, her teeth chattering violently. "Don't take me back. Angelo Strum. He beat me bad because one of Mustafa's horses threw a shoe, said he was going to sell me to the mines to work off the debt. I hid in your wagon. Please let me stay. I can shovel snow. I can chop wood." Bjorn let out a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had gone to town for coffee and came back with a mute woman and a runaway child. His solitary life was rapidly evaporating. He looked over at Brittany. She had climbed down from the wagon and was watching the exchange intently. "Get inside, both of you," Bjorn grumbled, pointing to the cabin door, "before you freeze to death." The first few weeks were an exercise in awkward, strained domesticity. The cabin was small, consisting of a main living area with a stone hearth and a small separate alcove where Bjorn slept. He gave the alcove to Brittany and Winnie, relegating himself to a bedroll near the fire. Bjorn expected to be doing all the work, but the reality proved surprisingly different. Brittany, though remaining entirely mute, began to assert a quiet, meticulous order over the chaos of the cabin. She didn't just cook stews. She identified wild, edible root vegetables and winter herbs in the surrounding woods that Bjorn had never noticed, turning salted pork and hardtack into rich, nourishing meals. When Bjorn's lead horse developed a severe, festering gash on its leg from a jagged rock, Bjorn prepared to put the animal down, assuming the infection was fatal. He walked into the stable to find Brittany already there. She had boiled water, crushed specific types of tree bark into a poultice, and was calmly and expertly cleaning the wound. The massive horse, usually temperamental and prone to kicking, stood perfectly still for her, sensing a calm, commanding authority. Bjorn watched from the shadows, his eyes narrowing. That wasn't the clumsy fumbling of a half-wit. That was the precise, practiced movement of someone with formal medical or veterinary knowledge. One evening, a blizzard trapped them inside for 3 days. Bjorn sat by the fire, struggling to repair the complex firing mechanism of his Winchester rifle. The spring was jammed, and his thick, scarred fingers couldn't manipulate the tiny gears. Frustrated, he set the rifle down to tend to the fire. When he turned back, Brittany was sitting at the table. In her delicate, surprisingly nimble hands, the rifle mechanism was completely disassembled. "Hey, don't touch that," Bjorn barked, stepping forward. Brittany didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Her hands moved in a blur of practiced precision. She realigned the jammed spring, slipped a tiny pin into place, and seamlessly reassembled the housing. She racked the lever, a satisfying, metallic clack-clack echoing in the cabin. She set the repaired rifle on the table, stood up, and went back to stirring the stew, all without making a sound. Winnie, who was sitting on the floor whittling a stick, looked up at Bjorn with wide eyes. "She's magic, Mr. Bjorn." Bjorn stared at the rifle, then at the woman's back. He picked up the gun. It functioned perfectly. He realized then, with a slow, creeping certainty, that Mustafa Forsell was an absolute fool. The woman he had won wasn't worthless. She wasn't broken. She was hiding in plain sight. And she was hiding something massive. Down in Deadwood's Folly, the atmosphere was growing toxic. Mustafa Forsell's vast wealth was built on a house of cards, extortion, high-interest loans, and rigged gambling. But his primary investment, a deep-shaft gold mine on the eastern slope, had flooded 2 weeks ago, drowning his profits and leaving him dangerously in debt to ruthless men back east. He was desperate for capital. His only hope was a rumor, a legend of a lost silver vein, supposedly mapped by an eccentric geological surveyor named Elias Sejak over a decade ago. Elias had died under mysterious circumstances, and his map had vanished. Mustafa had bought Elias's daughter, Brittany, hoping the girl knew something. When she refused to speak, exhibiting signs of severe mental trauma, he assumed she was a dead end, a useless mouth to feed. Now, pacing the floor of his opulent, velvet-lined office above the saloon, Mustafa was furious. Angelo Sturm stood by the door, picking dirt from under his fingernails with his hunting knife. "You shouldn't have let the mountain man take her, boss. She's a mute idiot," Mustafa snapped, throwing a crystal decanter against the wall, shattering it. "She knows nothing. But Lorenzo Mann has been asking questions. He's been digging into old land registry claims. He thinks the map still exists." Vajan Zabrozik, the corrupt mayor, wheezed as he adjusted his tight collar. "If she does know something, and Bjorn figures it out, we lose everything. Bjorn doesn't play our games. He won't be bought. Then we don't buy him," Angelo growled, a sadistic smile spreading across his scarred face. "We bury him." Meanwhile, back on the ridge, the snow had temporarily cleared. Bjorn had to make a quick trip to a trading post several miles down the mountain to replenish their coffee and buy winter clothes for Winnie. He left Brittany and Winnie at the cabin, instructing them to keep the door barred. At the trading post, Serena Smith, the shrewd, sharp-tongued woman who ran the general store, eyed Bjorn as she weighed his gold dust. "Heard you took Mustafa's pet," Serena said, her voice laced with a mix of disdain and curiosity. "Town's taking bets on when you'll bring her corpse back. Folks say she's cursed, brought bad luck to her father, brought bad luck to Mustafa." "You're a fool, Bjorn. I don't care about town gossip." "Serena," Bjorn grunted, shoving the supplies into a burlap sack. "Just give me the flour." As he turned to leave, a hand grabbed his arm. It was Lillian Pavoni, the saloon madam. She looked uncharacteristically nervous, glancing over her shoulder. "Bjorn," she hissed, pulling him into the shadow of the porch. "Mustafa is losing his mind. His Eastern investors are demanding payment. He's convinced that girl you took knows about her father's lost silver claim. Angelo is rallying a posse of hired guns. They aren't coming up your mountain to play cards. They're coming to take her back and gut you in the process." Bjorn's jaw tightened. "She's mute. She doesn't know anything about silver." Lillian smiled sadly. "In this world, Bjorn, survival takes many forms. Sometimes, silence is the strongest armor a woman can wear. Don't underestimate her, and don't underestimate how far Mustafa will go." Bjorn spurred his horse back up the mountain, pushing the animal to its limits. He arrived as the sun was dipping below the peaks, painting the snow in hues of blood and twilight. He burst into the cabin, expecting to find them terrified. Instead, he found a scene that froze him in his track. The heavy oak table in the center of the cabin had been cleared. Spread across it were a dozen pieces of charcoal, intricate geometric tools fashioned from whittled wood and wire, and a massive piece of tanned elk hide. Brittany was standing over the hide. She was drawing, not aimless doodles, but complex topographical lines, geological strata markers, and precise mathematical coordinates. She was moving with frantic, brilliant energy, her eyes alight with a fierce, burning intellect that took Bjorn's breath away. Winnie was sitting quietly in the corner, watching her with awe. Bjorn stepped forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. Brittany froze. She dropped the charcoal, her shoulders hunching defensively, the mask of the terrified half-wit sliding instantly back into place. She backed into the wall, lowering her head, waiting for the punishment she had been conditioned to expect. Bjorn looked at the highly sophisticated map on the table. Then, he looked at the cowering woman. "No more," Bjorn said softly, his voice trembling with a profound, unspoken emotion. "No more hiding, no more pretending. You don't have to be afraid here. Who are you?" For a long minute, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the hearth and the howling of the mountain wind outside. Brittany stood pressed against the log wall, her chest heaving, the internal battle playing out behind her hazel eyes was visible, the desperate instinct to remain hidden warring against the exhausting burden of her solitary secret. Slowly, agonizingly, she raised her head. The dull, vacant look melted away, replaced by a gaze so sharp, so piercingly intelligent, that Bjorn felt like he was being dissected. She opened her mouth. Her throat worked, struggling with muscles that hadn't been used for speech in over 2 agonizing years. "My name." Her voice was a raspy whisper, cracking like dry leaves underfoot. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes, then tried again. This time, the voice was stronger, layered with an undeniable, aristocratic defiance. "My name is Brittany Eleanor Sejak. I am a geological engineer, educated at the Sorbonne in Paris, and I am not worthless." Bjorn let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He pulled a chair out and gestured for her to sit. He went to the stove, poured a tin cup of hot coffee, and placed it gently in front of her. "Drink, tell me everything." As she wrapped her scarred hands around the warm metal, the dam finally broke. Brittany spoke, and the story she wove was one of brilliant discovery and brutal tragedy. Her father, Elias, was a master surveyor. Together, operating as equals despite the era's prejudice against women in science, they had mapped the high territories. 5 years ago, high in a secluded canyon technically adjacent to Bjorn's own trapping territory, they had discovered an anomaly, a massive, concentrated vein of pure native silver, richer than the Comstock lode. "We knew the danger," Brittany explained, her voice steadying, regaining its natural, cultured cadence. "My father wanted to register the claim properly, quietly, through lawyers in San Francisco. But Vagens Brozek, the mayor, caught wind of our geological samples. He tipped off Mustafa Forcel. Mustafa's men had ambushed them on the trail. Elias had been fatally shot. In his dying moments, he burned the physical map, knowing it was a death warrant. Mustafa took me to cover up the murder," Brittany said, her eyes darkening with the memory. "He thought I was just a silly girl, a daughter who knew nothing of the science. But I have an eidetic memory, Bjorn. I didn't need the map. The map was in my head. I realized quickly that if I spoke, if I showed any intelligence, Mustafa would torture the coordinates out of me and kill me. So, I retreated into my own mind. I became the mute, broken servant. It was the only way to survive, until I could find a way to escape." Bjorn sat back, utterly staggered by the sheer mental fortitude of the woman sitting across from him, to endure years of abuse, degradation, and mockery, while holding $1 billion secret in her mind, required a strength that made his own physical prowess seem insignificant. "Why draw it now?" Bjorn asked, pointing to the elk hide on the table. "Because of Winnie," Brittany said softly, glancing at the sleeping child in the alcove. "Mustafa is bankrupt. Lillian Pavone sent word through Lorenzo Mann, before you won me, Mustafa is desperate. He was planning to sell me to a notoriously brutal mining camp down south to recoup some cash. If you hadn't bought me at that table, I would be dead in a month. But now, they know Winnie is here. They know you have me. They are coming, Bjorn, and we need leverage." She stood up, walking over to the map. "This is your land, Bjorn. Your trapping claim. But look here." She traced a charcoal line. "The vein doesn't originate on the government land where my father died. The main lode, the heart of it, runs directly beneath the foundation of this very cabin." Bjorn stared at the map. "You're telling me I've been sleeping on top of the largest silver strike in the territory?" "I am telling you," Brittany said, a slow, fierce smile spreading across her face, the first time Bjorn had ever seen her smile. "And it was a breathtaking sight that we are going to use it to destroy them." Over the next 3 days, an incredible partnership formed. It wasn't a sudden, melodramatic romance, but a profound, unbreakable bond built on mutual respect. Bjorn provided the brute strength, the knowledge of the terrain, and the tactical defense. Brittany provided the intellect, the strategy, and the engineering genius. Using Bjorn's pickaxes and blasting powder, they widened a natural fissure at the bottom of the gorge behind the cabin. Within 48 hours of digging, Bjorn's pickaxe struck something that didn't spark like granite. It thudded. He held up his lantern. The rock wall was laced with thick, heavy ribbons of dull, blackened metal, native silver. It was so pure you could carve it with a pocket knife. "My God," Bjorn breathed. "We don't have time to mine it," Brittany said sharply, standing behind him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Mustafa's men are on the lower trail. I saw their campfires last night. They will be here by dawn. Then we fight," Bjorn said, gripping his rifle. "No, Bjorn. Fighting Mustafa's army directly is what they want. They have numbers. We have brains." Brittany's hazel eyes glinted with a terrifying, beautiful cunning. "We are going to let them win, and in doing so, we will bury them." Mustafa Forcell and his armed mercenaries crested the ridge at dawn, expecting a siege. Instead, they found Bjorn's cabin abandoned, the door wide open. Stomping inside, Mustafa's eyes immediately locked onto the heavy wooden table. Nailed to the center was the tanned elk hide map, marking a large red X in a canyon 5 miles north. "Look at this," Mustafa barked, laughing triumphantly. They fled in terror and left the map. "Saddle up. We ride for the North Canyon. Vajan, get your papers ready to register the strike." Hidden in the dense pines above, Bjorn, Brittany, and Winnie watched through a spyglass. "They took the bait," Bjorn whispered. "Of course," Brittany replied coldly. "I gave them the canyon where my father found trace elements. But what they don't know is that the rock there is highly unstable shale. When they dynamite it to open the face, the entire canyon wall will come down on them." Bjorn's eyes widened at her brutal genius. And the second half of the trap, Brittany produced a parchment bearing the territorial seal. "While you were buying supplies, I had Lorenzo Man courier a letter to the capital. I legally registered the claim beneath your cabin and used its projected assay value to buy up all of Mustafa's defaulted Eastern debts." Bjorn stared at her in awe. "What does that mean in English?" She smiled, a radiant expression of pure triumph. "It means, Bjorn, that as of yesterday, we own Mustafa's saloon, Vajan's bank, and the entire town of Deadwood's Folly." The explosion echoed through the mountains like the hammer of a furious god. 5 miles to the north, Mustafa's men had found the trace silver markings on the canyon wall exactly where the decoy map indicated. Blinded by the promise of infinite wealth, Mustafa had ordered Angelo to use a massive charge of blasting powder to blow open the rock face, ignoring the brittle, crumbling nature of the shale above them. When the powder detonated, it didn't reveal a vein of silver. It triggered a catastrophic, deafening landslide. Thousands of tons of rock, snow, and mud sheared off the canyon wall. Mustafa, Angelo, and his men barely managed to scramble up the opposite slope, coughing on the thick dust, watching in horror as their horses, their mining equipment, and their wagons were buried under 40 feet of impenetrable rubble. The motherlode was sealed forever beneath a mountain of stone. "No," Mustafa screamed, falling to his knees, clawing at his hair. Dig it out." Angelo grabbed him by the collar, dragging him backward as secondary rocks continued to fall. "It's gone, boss. We're lucky we ain't buried with it. We have to get back to town." Defeated, exhausted, and covered in grey dust, the villains were forced to make the grueling 5-mile trek back to Deadwood's Folly on foot, stumbling through the freezing snow. They arrived in town 2 days later, broken and desperate. Mustafa's expensive boots were ruined, his silk vest torn. He looked exactly like the desperate, pathetic men he usually preyed upon. He kicked open the doors of the Golden Nugget saloon, intending to demand free whiskey and rally his remaining thugs to hunt down Bjorn. Instead, he froze. The saloon was completely silent. The patrons were standing awkwardly around the edges of the room. Standing behind the main bar, pouring a glass of expensive bourbon, was Lillian Pavoni. Beside her stood Lorenzo Man, holding a very large, double-barreled shotgun, looking remarkably relaxed. Sitting at the very poker table where he had wagered her away weeks ago was Brittany Sejak. She was no longer wearing burlap. She wore a tailored, dark wool riding habit, her hair clean and pinned up, revealing her sharp, aristocratic features. She looked like a queen sitting on a conquered throne. Beside her stood Bjorn, massive, silent, and immovable as a mountain, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "What is the meaning of this?" Mustafa snarled, stepping forward, though his men hesitated behind him. "Angelo," Clear these people out of my saloon. Angelo stepped forward, reaching for his knife. The distinct, terrifying sound of a Winchester rifle cocking stopped him cold. Little Winnie Torstenson, wearing a brand-new, thick winter coat, was sitting on the balcony railing above. The barrel of Bjorn's repaired rifle resting on the banister pointed directly at Angelo's chest. The girl's face was utterly devoid of fear. "I wouldn't," Brittany said. Her voice rang through the saloon, clear, cultured, and commanding. Mustafa stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock. You can speak." "I always could, Mustafa," Brittany replied, standing up slowly. "I simply had nothing to say to a parasite. But I have plenty to say now." She picked up a thick stack of legal documents from the poker table and tossed them onto the floor at Mustafa's ruined boots. "Those are the foreclosure notices from your Eastern investors," Brittany said, her voice dripping with icy satisfaction. "Your debts have been called in, and since you failed to pay, your assets have been seized. I purchased those debts using the assay collateral of the largest silver strike in the territory. A strike safely located directly beneath Bjorn's cabin." Vajen Zabrozek pushed his way to the front, sweating profusely. "This is illegal. I am the mayor. I am the judge. I invalidate these documents." "You aren't the mayor anymore, Vajen," Lorenzo Mann spoke up from the bar, smiling broadly. Federal marshals arrived on the morning train. "It seems someone mailed them a highly detailed ledger of your extortion practices and embezzlement over the last 5 years. They're waiting for you at the sheriff's office." Vajen squeaked, turning pale, and immediately bolted for the back door, only to be intercepted by 2 burly townsmen who had finally had enough of his corruption. Mustafa fell to his knees, staring at the documents. The realization crashed down upon him. The mute, worthless girl he had beaten, starved, and gambled away had systematically dismantled his entire empire from the shadows. She had used his own greed to bury his men and his resources, while legally pulling the rug out from under his entire life. "You have nothing left, Mustafa," Brittany said, walking around the table, standing over him just as he had once stood over her. "You don't own this saloon. You don't own the bank. You don't own anyone. You are bankrupt. You are ruined. And if you or your dog Angelo are seen within territorial lines by sunset, Lorenzo here has my full authorization to shoot you for trespassing on my property." She looked down at him, her hazel eyes blazing with the fire of 1,000 silent days finally given voice. "Now, get out of my town." Mustafa, broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated, scrambled to his feet. He didn't say a word. With Angelo trailing behind him like a whipped cur, the former tyrant of Deadwood's Folly walked out the swinging doors and into the freezing mud, vanishing into history as a penniless beggar. Bjorn and Brittany didn't stay in the town they now owned. They left its management to Lillian and Lorenzo, choosing instead to return to the quiet peace of the mountain ridge. They built a sprawling, beautiful estate over the silver mine, raising Winnie as their own. Their partnership, forged in silence and survival, blossomed into a deep, unshakable love built on mutual respect and shared strength. Brittany's story reminds us of a powerful truth in life. Never underestimate the quiet ones. True strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it calculates, observes, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. The people the world deems worthless or broken are often carrying the most incredible potential, hiding their brilliance to survive the arrogant fools around them. Arrogance and greed will always be the architects of their own downfall, but patience and intellect will always build a lasting kingdom. If this story of hard karma, brilliant revenge, and finding value where others see none resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a great twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, dramatic stories of resilience and justice. Let me know in the comments, what was your favorite moment of Brittany's brilliant revenge? Stay strong, keep your secrets safe, and we'll see you in the next one.